Hello, this time it's for real. Thank you. All right, well, welcome once again to the Daniel Island Community Speaker Series. My name is Steve Slifer. I'm one of the Rotarians here. I'll be the host for the evening. We certainly have a full house, and we are thrilled that Judge Gergel has agreed to join us this evening. And as I always do, most of you know this by heart by now, but it's important for you to know that this event has got 4 different sponsors. One, of course, is the Rotary Club here on Daniel Island, but also the Daniel Island Business Association, the Daniel Island Community Fund, and also the Daniel Island Club, where we're all sitting here. So, I am very proud of the fact that we've got 4 different organizations here on the island that have all sort of pulled together. And this really is kind of a joint effort amongst them. And we've been doing this now. We're in the middle of our 11th season for this speaker series, and just judging from the crowd tonight, and the crowd, similar sized crowds every single time, seems like we've kind of struck something that kind of resonates with you all. So thank you all for coming and supporting this. We have the usual crowd, but maybe the crowd seems a little bit bigger tonight than it has been, and that's because we have the addition of about 15 Bishop England students and their teachers here with us today. So they're going to get their little lesson in American history this evening, and then they're going to go back and all right, this is where we go into the coming attractions part of all of this. And I think I told you before, back in November, that our speaker for January is going to be Alex Hellbath. He was at the speaker series back in September, and many of you may have had an opportunity to meet him then. Alex is a retired Air Force colonel. He was a special operations pilot in the Air Force. He was the commanding officer for the mission responsible for the evacuation of the civilians and the military personnel from Kabul. And we've certainly all seen and remember those pictures of what that looked like with all the people hanging from the struts of the airplane. So that situation can only, I guess, be described as chaotic. And Air Force officers in their training, they're kind of taught how to deal with various situations. You know, this comes up, you do this, you do this, that. But the rule book obviously can't cover every single situation, and this was one of them. The only word that could be used to describe that situation for those last few days, I guess, is chaotic. And so somehow the Air Force also, when you get one of these chaotic situations that aren't in the rule book, it relies on its officers to, quote, do the right thing. And I dare say all of these people did. They performed a nearly impossible mission admirably, and we should certainly be proud of all of them, and we're fortunate that on January 24th, Alex will be joining us. So if you might want to mark your calendar for that one as well. Now, all right, let's move on to Judge Gergel. He's been on my radar screen, our radar screen, for a while now. And the reason is that I keep reading my Post and Courier, and every time I turn around, I'm reading something else about some case that the man has tried. I'm going, that's really cool. I want to find the dirt on what's behind the scenes on this. Unfortunately, this is not what that's going to be tonight. So sorry, if anybody's going to leave now, you can, but I don't think you do. We are fortunate that one of our Rotarians, Kathy Bergeson, attended a presentation that Judge Gergel gave up in New York, of all places, Western New York. And she came back with rave reviews about his presentation. So that kind of bumped him up into the queue and sort of started our little discussion. And obviously, Judge Gergel has been kind enough to join us this evening. You know a little bit about the man, but you don't. I'll give you a little bit of other information, and I'm going to turn it over to him. First of all, what you perhaps don't know, he's a South Carolina guy, raised in Columbia, went to Duke for his undergraduate school, Duke Law School for his law degree. A couple years later, he opened his own law firm in Columbia. And then in 2009, so this was some years later, then President Obama says, okay, I'm going to nominate you to serve on the U.S. District Court for the District of South Carolina. And so he was approved a year later in 2010. And that is basically where the story you're going to hear tonight begins. While he was awaiting confirmation, he knew that one of his predecessors was this guy, Waties Waring. And you go, who is this man? Nobody's ever really heard about him. Nobody, including Judge Gergel, knew much about the man either. So he set out on this little quest to find out more about him. What he learned, and you'll get the full story here in just a minute, is that Waring was an 8th generation Charlestonian. I believe that his ancestors owned slaves. So he clearly is part of the Charleston aristocracy, I guess is the only way to kind of put it. So he's got that, but somewhere along the line, he flipped and he suddenly became much of a civil rights visionary, sort of the polar opposite of what he had been before. And so the question I know that Richard was trying to figure out is, what in the world flipped this man? What changed? So that's going to be the story that we're going to hear tonight. And he wrote that in the subject of his book as well, Unexampled Courage, The Blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard and the Awakening of U.S. President Harry Truman and Judge J. Waties Waring. So at the end of the presentation and following the Q&A, you can get some of your copies of the book, and Judge will be more than happy to sign that. So, enough from me, ladies and gentlemen. Let me turn this over to Judge Richard Gergel.
I've given a lot of talks around the country, but I've now concluded that if you include a glass of wine, then suddenly I seem more interesting. Now, I gotta say, for the high school students, you can't do that, okay? First of all, lovely to be at a Rotary Club meeting. My dad was a life member of Rotary. My wife was a Rotary member. She was a member of City Council in Columbia, and she was an active Rotarian. And so it's great to be here among friends. When I assumed the bench in the Charleston Federal Courthouse in August 2010, I wanted to learn more about a predecessor, United States District Judge J. Waties Waring, who served in the Charleston Courthouse from 1942 to 1952, and was the first of the courageous Southern judges who upheld the rights of all citizens during the emergence of the early civil rights movement after World War II. The little that had been written about Judge Waring, as I began trying to investigate his background, made him something of an enigma, with no understanding of what converted this Charleston patrician into a civil rights visionary. Once I began a search for an answer to the question of what caused Judge Waring to change, the story of Unexampled Courage emerged. As the clock struck 7 p.m. on August 14, 1945, President Harry Truman assembled the White House press corps in the Oval Office. The ebullient president, standing behind his desk, informed the reporters that earlier that afternoon, the Japanese government had unconditionally surrendered, bringing an end at last to World War II. The reporters spontaneously burst into applause and then raced for the door to share this remarkable announcement with the rest of the nation. Thousands gathered in Lafayette Square across from the White House to celebrate, and soon there were calls, "We want Truman, we want Truman." The president went onto the north portico of the White House to make a few remarks. "This is a great day for free governments in the world," Truman announced. "This is the day that fascism and police government ceases in the world. The great task ahead is to restore peace and bring free government to the world." But beneath the veneer of America's grand self-image as the bastion of freedom and liberty was a stark reality. African Americans residing in the old Confederacy lived in a twilight world between slavery and freedom. They no longer had masters, but they did not enjoy the rights of a free people. Black Southerners were routinely denied the right to vote, segregated physically from the dominant white society as a matter of law, and relegated to the margins of American prosperity. Racial violence and lynchings festered just beneath the surface, ready to explode at any moment. Now that image was known as the lynching flag. It flew every morning after a lynching in America, outside the national office of the NAACP. And in the first half of the 20th century, that was a common sight in lower Manhattan, New York. 4,000 lynchings in America before 1950. It was an astounding number. Black Americans, and most of those occurred in the South. Black Americans living in other regions of the country had their own challenges. As the nearly 900,000 black veterans returned home at the end of World War II, they quickly realized that little had changed, and they began demanding their rightful place in America's free government. Seen from today's perspective, the American triumph over Jim Crow segregation and disenfranchisement might seem to have been inevitable, the collapse of morally indefensible practices wholly inconsistent with the United States Constitution. But in 1945, with black Southerners almost entirely disenfranchised, white-dominated Southern state governments resolutely committed to the racial status quo, and the federal government largely a passive bystander, there was no obvious path to resolve this great American dilemma. Something had to be done, but what and by who? My book, Unexampled Courage, details a long overlooked story of the beating and blinding of Sergeant Isaac Woodard. Now we'll see this, there we go. A battlefield decorated African American soldier by the police chief in Batesburg, South Carolina, on the day of his discharge from the military and while still in uniform. And the transformative impact of this incident on President Harry Truman and United States District Judge J. Waties Waring of Charleston. Horrified and inspired by the injustice of this brutal event, President Truman would launch a civil rights program culminating in the ending of segregation in the armed forces of the United States. And Judge Waring would issue landmark civil rights decisions, including his renowned 1951 dissent in Briggs versus Elliott, which would become the model for Brown versus Board of Education 3 years later. Late in the afternoon of February 12, 1946, Isaac Woodard boarded a Greyhound bus in Augusta, Georgia, after discharge hours earlier from nearby Camp Gordon. And he was traveling to Columbia and then to Winnsboro, South Carolina, where he was to rendezvous with his wife after 3 years of separation occasioned by his war service. During one of the frequent stops along the way, Woodard approached the white bus driver and asked if he could step off the bus to relieve himself. The bus was making frequent stops along the way, and Greyhound drivers were instructed to accommodate such requests by their passengers. Instead, the bus driver cursed Woodard, telling him, "I ain't got time to wait," and ordered him to return to his seat at the back of the bus. To the apparent astonishment of the bus driver, Woodard snapped back at him, telling him, "Talk to me like I'm talking to you. I am a man just like you." The stunned bus driver told Woodard to go ahead at the next stop. But when he arrived in Batesburg, South Carolina, the bus driver, now apparently no longer concerned about staying on schedule, departed his bus in search of a police officer to have Woodard removed from the bus and arrested. Woodard soon found himself confronted by the police chief of Batesburg, Linwood Shull, who responded to Woodard's efforts to explain himself by striking him over the head with his blackjack. and escorting Woodard off to the town jail. On his way, Woodard was repeatedly beaten with Shaw's blackjack, ultimately driving the end of the baton into each of his eyes. The sergeant was then thrown in a semi-conscious state into a jail cell for the night. When he awoke the next morning, he realized he could not see. Later that morning, Woodard was taken to the town court, and he was convicted of drunk and disorderly conduct. Accounts of the Woodard beating and blinding were reported in the black press and received nationwide attention when Orson Welles focused on the incident in his weekly national radio program on ABC Radio. Mass meetings were organized in black communities across the nation to protest Woodard's treatment. One example was a benefit concert for Sergeant Woodard in New York City, headed by Joe Louis and featuring such luminaries as Count Basie, Cab Calloway, and Nat King Cole, which played to a sold-out audience of 23,000. Now that's the announcement of the benefit concert. And then that's a picture of Joe Louis, who was then the reigning heavyweight champion of the world, escorting Isaac Woodard to a press conference to announce the benefit concert. Meanwhile, other African-American veterans returning to their homes in the rural South confronted other incidents of racial violence, including racially inspired murders. No state prosecuted those involved in any of these racial incidents. Now, I'll highlight another point. I mentioned to you at the beginning of this talk, there were 4,000 lynchings in America. Before 1950, not one of the perpetrators was ever prosecuted successfully. No one was ever held accountable. When people today tell me nothing has changed, I tell them you don't know American history. On September 19, 1946, a delegation of civil rights leaders met with President Truman in the White House. Prior to the meeting, Truman's staff advised him that despite his desire to respond to the concerns of the civil rights leaders, there was little he could do as a practical matter as president to address their concerns. Criminal prosecutions by the federal government for civil rights violations in the South were fraught with problems. Most notably, all-white juries deeply unsympathetic to civil rights cases. And why were the juries all white? Because they came from voter lists, and African Americans were largely disenfranchised. Further, Congress was under the control of powerful Southern committee chairs who were determined to block even the most modest civil rights legislation, including making lynching a federal crime. As the meeting opened, civil rights leaders urged Truman to call Congress back into session to address the spreading violence against black veterans. The president expressed sympathy, but lamented there was little he could do because there was simply not public support for new civil rights legislation. Leading the group was Walter White, and in this image, he is the gentleman to our right of Truman, to actually his left, but to our right here. Walter White is sort of a forgotten figure, but in 1946, at the time of this meeting, he was the most important civil rights leader in America. And he was the executive director of the NAACP, and he was an ardent political supporter of President Truman. Now, as the president was explaining to the group, I'm really sympathetic, but there's not much I can do, it was apparent to Walter White that the president did not appreciate the gravity of the situation. He changed the discussion by sharing with the president in detail the blinding of Isaac Woodard. As the tragic story unfolded, Truman sat riveted and became visibly agitated with the idea that a uniformed and battlefield-decorated American soldier had been so cruelly treated. Abandoning the advice of his staff, Truman stated, "My God, I had no idea it was as terrible as that. We have got to do something." The following day, Truman wrote his Attorney General, Tom Clark, and shared with him the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard, noting that the police officer had deliberately put out Woodard's eyes. Truman made it clear that the time for federal action had now arrived. He further indicated he intended to appoint the first Presidential Committee on Civil Rights to propose a new agenda to address what was obviously America's very serious racial problems. 3 business days after Truman's letter was delivered to the Attorney General, the United States Department of Justice announced the prosecution of Batesburg Police Chief Linwood Shaw in the Federal District Court in South Carolina for the deprivation of the civil rights of Isaac Woodard. Meanwhile, the Department of Justice prepared the necessary documents to organize the first Presidential Committee on Civil Rights. Truman charged his committee in his first meeting on January 15, 1947, to be bold and to attack the root causes of America's deep-seated racial problems. He held the Civil Rights Committee's first meeting in the Cabinet Room to emphasize the importance of its work. In less than a year, the Truman Civil Rights Committee issued a landmark report titled "To Secure These Rights," which graphically detailed America's profound racial challenges and proposed groundbreaking policies and legislation, including the ending of segregation in the armed forces of the United States. Truman fully, publicly embraced the proposals of his Civil Rights Committee. And on July 26, 1948, in the midst of his re-election campaign, the President issued Executive Order 9981, mandating the integration of America's armed forces. Now that's a headline from an African-American newspaper, a prominent one of the day, the Chicago Defender. And the headline is pretty, it's bold. President Truman wipes out segregation and armed forces. But look at the headline to the bottom right. Posse bent on lynching searches woods for prey. This is America in 1947, 48. Truman's, and I'll be glad in the question and answer to go into a little bit more detail about this. Truman's decision to desegregate the military created the first multiracial organization in America. Didn't exist before. And basically was the beginning of the end of Jim Crow in America. The Justice Department's efforts to prosecute Linwood Shaw, the police chief of Batesburg, in the Federal District Court in Columbia, South Carolina, produced in the short term a predictable result. An all-white, and my wife likes to point out, all-male jury acquitted the police chief in 28 minutes. The case was tried before United States District Judge J. Waties Waring of Charleston. A Charleston patrician whose his father was a Confederate veteran, and multiple generations of ancestors were slaveholders. Prior to the trial, Judge Waring was skeptical about the federal government's prosecution of a local police officer, but his views changed when he heard the highly credible testimony of the blinded sergeant, who described his arrest and vicious beating at the hands of the police chief. As Shaw's supporters cheered his acquittal, few noticed that Judge Waring's wife, Elizabeth, who had attended the trial, left the back of the courtroom in tears. Judge Waring joined his wife later that evening, and both were traumatized by the trial over which he had just presided. The Shaw trial forced the judge and his wife to stare directly into the Southern racial abyss, a view that would forever transform both of them. Waring later described the Shaw trial as his personal baptism of fire and his Michigan-born wife's baptism in racial prejudice. The Warings returned home to Charleston. We're gonna get this thing to work yet. Whoops, I went too far. Let's see, there we go. The Warings returned home after the Shaw trial to Charleston. The trial was in Columbia, resolved to learn more about issues of race and justice, which the Warings had previously thought little about. These were not subjects which could be openly discussed in polite society, white society in Charleston. The Warings decided to undertake their own self-directed study. Each evening after dinner, Elizabeth would read a portion of a selected work to allow the judge to rest his eyes after a day handling his judicial duties. The couple would then discuss what they had read, often while driving around Charleston in the evening, a favorite pastime. People have asked me, well, what did they read? Well, we actually know what they read because they had some newspaper interviews where they told people what they had begun reading. One was a book from a South Carolinian, authored by a South Carolinian by the name of W.J. Cash, called The Mind of the South. That book took the controversial view at the time that the lynching and violence in the South was a natural outgrowth of slavery, which Cash described as a vicious and violent institution. Now that was different from the sort of popular lore that slavery, yeah, it was wrong, but it was benign and not too bad. Cash saw it in a very different light. The book was, Judge Waring would later say that it was tough medicine for him to read, but he came to the conclusion that he was right. Thereafter, Judge Waring and his wife read together a 1,400-page study on race titled The American Dilemma by Gunnar Myrdal. Gunnar Myrdal was a Swedish economist and sociologist, and the Carnegie Foundation wanted to fund a study on race after World War II. They thought maybe we ought to get a non-American to lead it. And Gunnar Myrdal was a very renowned scholar. The book is, even by reading today, is one of the most remarkable studies of race ever written in America. It is cited in Brown versus Board of Education. And Gunnar Myrdal would later be appointed, would receive the Nobel Prize. After the Warings read together Gunnar Myrdal's classic book, 1,400 pages, there was no turning back. As Judge Waring's new views on race and justice emerged, George Elmore, we're going to get this thing to work yet, a black businessman in Columbia, filed suit challenging in 1947 the South Carolina Democratic Party's all-white primary. That is, only white people could vote in the only election that then mattered in the one-party state. Elmore was represented in his lawsuit by Thurgood Marshall, the 39-year-old chief counsel of the NAACP, who was already developing a reputation of almost legendary proportions as a skilled litigator and legal strategist. South Carolina political leaders were united in their determination to preserve the white primary, notwithstanding the fact that there was clear U.S. Supreme Court precedent declaring such white primaries unconstitutional. When Judge Waring was assigned the case, he came home that night and he said, Elizabeth, we've been thinking about these issues of race and justice, but no one knows how we're thinking. If I rule for the plaintiffs in this case, our lives will never be the same. Elizabeth, now a convert to the cause, said, I'll be with you from start to finish. Judge Waring would later state in an oral history after his retirement that in this case he had to make a choice, either, quote, to be entirely governed by the doctrine of white supremacy, or to be a federal judge and decide the law. On July 12, 1947, Judge Waring issued his decision in Elmore versus Rice, declaring South Carolina's white primary unconstitutional. He ended his order by stating, it is time for South Carolina to rejoin the Union and to adopt the American way of conducting elections. The groundbreaking nature of the Elmore decision was immediately appreciated by the leadership of the NAACP. In a private note to Thurgood Marshall, William Hastie, who would later be the first black federal judge in American history, stated, Thurgood, I have read the South Carolina opinion 3 times, and I still don't believe it. In many respects, I think this is your greatest legal achievement. But the segregationists would not give up. Soon, a new party rule was adopted, allowing African Americans to vote in the party primary so long as they pledge to support racial segregation. Surprise, a new lawsuit was filed, and on July 16, 1948, Judge Waring summoned all 93 members of the party's executive committee to his courtroom in the Charleston courthouse. He denounced their efforts to defy his earlier ruling and explained that a federal judge faced with contempt could impose a fine or a jail sentence. He wanted those present to know that if they violated his order again, there would be no fines. Think about that for a moment. He was basically telling the most powerful political leaders in this state that he would put them in jail if they violated the voting rights of African American citizens. Thereafter, African Americans by the thousands registered to vote in South Carolina. And this is an image of a group being registered to vote. And I will tell you, Mississippi the Mississippi Democratic primary in 1948, 3,500 African Americans voted. In South Carolina, 35,000 voted. And the gentleman, our second one to our left here, is Mr. Elmore himself being sworn. The response of South Carolina's white supremacists to Waring's rulings were thunderous. Death threats, written and oral, were constant. A cross was burned at his residence, and bricks were thrown through his living room window. There were so many reports of planned assassination of the judge that the United States Marshal Service provided him 24-hour security. Time magazine described Waring as the man they loved to hate, but also noted he was proving to be a person of cool courage. If the purpose of the unprecedented vilification of Waring was intended to coward him, it didn't work. Instead, he continued his study and reflection on race and justice in America and became convinced that the foundation of Jim Crow segregation, the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy v. Ferguson, was legally, historically, and morally wrong. Waring, then approaching 70 years of age and likely retirement, resolved to play a role in overturning the separate but equal doctrine. Waring developed a plan to place a school desegregation case onto the docket of the United States Supreme Court, firmly convinced that a majority of the justices would overturn Plessy if they directly confronted the issue. Many people have asked me, why was he so certain that a majority of the Supreme Court would overturn segregation? And I've said to them, well, he might have been vilified in South Carolina, but among the federal judges, he was greatly respected, and he knew all 9 justices, and he had been to Washington. He had counted noses. He noted on his trial docket a case from Clarendon, South Carolina, Briggs versus Elliott, which sought to equalize the facilities of the district's black and white schools. Now, what the NAACP was doing at this time was bringing what came to be known as Plessy cases. The practice in the South was separate and unequal. So these cases would not challenge segregation, they would challenge inequality. And they were winning these cases because the schools were profoundly unequal. In Somerton, where this case arose, the white children attended brick schools with indoor plumbing, landscape grounds, and black children had buildings, wooden structures nearly falling down, and they had outhouses and got their water from a well. Somerton was a poster child of inequality. When the plaintiff's attorney, Thurgood Marshall, appeared at the courthouse on November 17, 1950, for what is known as a pretrial conference. I have them in every case. We're gonna get this thing to work yet. There we go. That's Thurgood Marshall, by the way, arriving in the Charleston train station to try Briggs versus Elliott. That image is really worth a story itself. There was a 14-year-old young man by the name of Cecil Williams. He would go on to be one of the great photo documenters of the Civil Rights Movement. But in 1950, Cecil Williams was 14 years old. He lived in Orangeburg. And he persuaded a family member to drive him to Charleston because he heard the great man was coming to Charleston. And he was a photo buff. He wanted to get a picture. But when he arrived, he looked in his camera bag and he realized he had a problem. Remember we used to have those flashes, right? Yeah. You only had a few, he had one. So he had to get exactly in the right spot to get Marshall as he came off the train. And that is probably the most famous picture of Thurgood Marshall. It hung in his Supreme Court chambers. And Cecil now has a museum in Orangeburg. If you ever get up there, that is a very prominent picture in the museum. Well, Thurgood Marshall arrives at the courthouse on a Friday. The trial, I always do this, a Friday before a trial begins on Monday. I have the lawyers in, and we address pretrial issues. He was there. He's going to try this Plessy case, this challenging the inequality of the Somerton School District. When he arrives, the court security officer says, the judge wants to see you in chambers. He goes up and he's looking around. He doesn't see his opposing counsel. Now, for my lawyer friends, that's called an ex parte communication, okay? Marshall is brought into Waring's office and he said, Thurgood, I don't want to try another separate and equal case. Bring me a frontal challenge to segregation. At this moment, there had never been a frontal challenge to Plessy. There hadn't been a dissent from Plessy since 1896. And there had never been a lawsuit challenging segregation in the public schools. Marshall was a pragmatist. He had won a lot of cases on the strategy of being incremental, not ever getting ahead of the Supreme Court, building one brick on top of another in legal precedents. Their plan was they had won in those years before. They had won a case involving professional schools. They planned to go to colleges and then down to public schools outside the South. And the last place they would have brought a segregation case was in Somerton, South Carolina. And here was the judge who was saying to them, bring it in this little rural community. Marshall said, Judge, if I do that, you will be overruled immediately by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Richmond. He says, no, I won't, because if you challenge the constitutionality of the state law mandating segregation, the Fourth Circuit will appoint a 3-judge panel. I'll be on it. And it directly goes to the U.S. Supreme Court. And he said, well, we'll lose 2-1. He says, you will. But you'll be in the U.S. Supreme Court. And Thurgood, that's where you want to be. He knew the result. He just had to get the case there. Marshall, this violated every principle Marshall had followed in terms of legal strategy. And he was basically going for singles and doubles. And here was a judge he really revered who told him the time is to swing for the fences. He left the office. I've read an interview by a friend of his who was waiting outside the office. He said Marshall came out, he could hardly speak because he had to make a decision fast what he was going to do. And a few minutes later, they opened the hearing in the courtroom, in our historic courtroom in the Charleston courthouse. And Waring said, Mr. Marshall, are you challenging the constitutionality of racial segregation in the public schools? Marshall said, Your Honor, I am. He says, then you're going to dismiss this action and refile it. Well, that presented its own set of dilemma. Because what Marshall was agreeing to do would place those 21 plaintiffs sitting in Somerton in great jeopardy. There was one thing challenging that you didn't have a school bus. That's another thing challenging the whole structure of Jim Crow. And Marshall sent his top lieutenant, a fellow named Robert Carter. I had the chance in preparing the book of interviewing he later became a federal judge, Robert Carter. And he sent Carter to Somerton. They met at a AME church right near Christmas. And the place was packed, sort of like this. And he told the folks, Mr. Marshall thinks it is time to attack segregation root and branch. You don't have to do this. If you feel like you don't feel comfortable being a plaintiff, you can withdraw. But we're going forward. A gentleman in the back of the room, an elderly gentleman, stood up and said, we were wondering how long it would take you lawyers to figure this out. No one withdrew. And the new lawsuit was filed. The newly filed Briggs case was tried in the Charleston Federal Courthouse in May 1951 before a 3-judge panel, as I mentioned earlier, which included Judge Waring. In prior years, civil rights cases in the South were sparsely attended by members of the black community, lest they be identified as members of the NAACP or otherwise challenging the racial status quo. But the morning of May 28, 1951, as the sun rose in Charleston, African Americans lined up at the federal courthouse and down Broad Street as far as the eye could see, hoping to observe what many thought might be the most important case in American history. Judge Waring, looking out of his office window, later described the scene of this massive crowd as a breath of freedom. And my friend Jonathan Green has painted a wonderful painting of the opening day of the trial of Briggs versus Elliott. And if you look in here, you'll see Judge Waring in the window looking out. And he titled the painting, Breath of Freedom. Those in attendance in the courtroom were not disappointed by the performance of Thurgood Marshall and his trial team. The trial included the testimony of Dr. Kenneth Clark. You may be familiar with we're going to get this, of the doll studies. Kenneth Clark and his wife, Dr. Mamie Clark, were the first African-American PhDs from Columbia University. And they had observed, as many African-Americans have shared with me, the reality that many black children only wanted white dolls. What did that mean? And they did, and as they began studying this, they tested these children. What doll has positive traits, is honest, is clean, he wants to be your friend? Which one do you not want to associate with? And all across the country, the children picked the white dolls. And they concluded that this was the impact of Jim Crow segregation, giving children, scarring them for life, a profound sense of inferiority. There was a huge controversy within the NAACP about offering this testimony. When Dr. Clark testified in the Charleston Federal Courthouse, no social science evidence of that type had ever been offered in an American courtroom. And many of the more establishment, traditional members of the NAACP trial team said, this will look like a gimmick. You don't need to, they're gonna laugh us out of the courtroom. But Marshall said, I'm an old trial lawyer, and if I'm trying to prove someone has a broken arm, I put up an x-ray. I'm gonna show through Dr. Clark's testimony that these children are broken. And he said, I'll do it on one condition. He tells Robert Carter, who was advancing, and he was a friend of Dr. Clark's, and was promoting the use of this testimony. He says, Dr. Clark has to go to Somerton and test the children there, because they'll claim it doesn't apply in South Carolina. He traveled across the country. So Clark came down on the train with Thurgood Marshall to Charleston a few days before the trial. And he thought Thurgood Marshall was going to go to Somerton with him to do these tests. And he says, Mr. Marshall, I'm going down tomorrow. What time do we leave? He said, I'm not going to Somerton. They killed me. The next morning, he thought Marshall was kidding. A young kid, a staff member of the NAACP drove him to Somerton, and an African-American principal of the elementary school arranged for the kids to be tested, and the white school board lawyer never was told, and he learned about it at trial. So here is this testimony. And so, of course, the question was, how do you know this applies to Somerton? He said, well, I did test 16 children in Somerton 2 weeks ago, or this week. The school board lawyer was just almost, he didn't know what to do with his testimony, because every time he asked a question, obviously Dr. Clark knew more about this subject than he did. And he finally just said, oh, nobody will believe any of this. Well, Judge Waring, in his dissent, described it in detail. And in Brown versus Board of Education, Chief Justice Warren, writing for the unanimous court, said the difference between what we knew then and know now is the damage to children. And he cited the Clark study. It was the key piece of evidence that the court in 1954 relied on in overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. As Waring predicted, the majority of the panel ruled, the three-judge panel ruled, that South Carolina's laws mandating segregated schools were lawful under the Plessy doctrine. But Waring, fully aware he was writing a dissent for the ages, wrote an elegant and brilliant attack on the foundations of segregation in America. He concluded by finding segregation in education can never produce equality, and it is an evil that must be eradicated. Segregation in education adopted and practiced in the state of South Carolina must go, and go now. Segregation is per se inequality. Written in June 1951. Judge Waring, in his dissent, also praised the plaintiffs in Briggs, those 21 hardy souls who did not withdraw. He was fully aware that they had suffered, each of them, severe retaliation for participating in the case. A woman who worked as a maid at a hotel was fired. Her husband worked at a gas station. He was fired. People who had to gin nobody would gin their cotton. Their loans were called. And eventually, all of them had to leave Somerton, and they were so severely retaliated against. Judge Waring knew about all of this, and he said that, he mentioned these plaintiffs. He says, they have shown unexampled courage in bringing and presenting this cause in the face of the long-established and age-old way of life which the state of South Carolina has adopted and practiced and lived in since and as a result of the institution of human slavery. Waring's dissent was the first challenge to public school segregation by a federal judge since the Plessy case 55 years earlier. Some have asked, how could Judge Waring, a federal district judge, presume to overrule an existing U.S. Supreme Court precedent? Judge Waring did not think he was doing that. The year prior to his great dissent, the Supreme Court decided 3 important civil rights cases, one involving a separate but not equal law school in Texas, that was called Sweat versus Painter, another involving a graduate student at the University of Oklahoma, George McLaurin, who was allowed to enter the school but was required to sit outside the classroom. There he is sitting outside the classroom. That was an exhibit in the U.S. Supreme Court. And the third was McLaurin versus Board of Regents. The third was Henderson versus United States, challenging segregated dining cars on interstate trains. In all 3 cases, the plaintiffs won 9-0. Many commentators said, well, this is a further whittling away of the Plessy case. But Judge Waring, reading the 3 together, believed they stood for the proposition that separate could never be equal. He foresaw that the court was ready to reverse. In early 1952, some 6 months after his great dissent, Waring announced his retirement as a federal judge, and moved to New York City, exhausted with the ostracism he was experiencing in Charleston. The judge followed closely later school desegregation cases filed in Virginia, Delaware, and Kansas, all which were consolidated before the United States Supreme Court with Briggs versus Elliott under the name Brown versus Board of Education. But all the other school desegregation cases involving 14 different judges, only Waties Waring had concluded that public school segregation, even if the facilities were equal, violated the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court handed down unanimously its landmark decision in Brown versus Board of Education. The court explicitly cast aside the separate but equal doctrine and adopted the per se rule that all governmental mandated public school segregation was unconstitutional, first advanced by Judge Waring in his Briggs dissent. Judge Waring was always philosophical about what he called the unpleasant repercussions of his civil rights decisions. In an oral history late in life, Waring observed, taking the whole thing in balance, I think I'm enormously fortunate because you don't often in life have the opportunity to do something you really think is good. I think a great stroke of fortune came down my alley. The other penalties don't amount to anything. They're offset by what I think is a really important contribution to the history of our country. Several years ago, as I was finishing Unexampled Courage, I returned to the town of Batesburg and retraced the fateful path of Isaac Woodard from the bus stop where he was removed from the Greyhound bus and arrested, to the storefront around the corner where he was beaten and blinded, and to the location up the street where the town jail and court once stood. Joining me on this solemn walk was the mayor of Batesburg and the town attorney, both of whom had only recently learned of the Woodard incident from me. On June 1, 2018, the town attorney filed a motion in court to reopen the case of the town of Batesburg versus Isaac Woodard, the unjust conviction. And the court vacated the decision. And in March 2020, the town of Batesburg dedicated an historic marker candidly telling the story of the blinding of Isaac Woodard. Members of Sergeant Woodard's family traveled from New York for the ceremony, and the mayor publicly apologized on behalf of the town for the tragic events of that fateful evening, February 12, 1946. Unexampled Courage is a story that deserves to be told, with all of its pathos, its brutality, and its redemption of the American system of justice. Thank you very much. And I'll be glad to answer any questions anyone might have.
Matt will be over there with the microphone. Oh, we got two here.
Has anybody else heard this story? I haven't heard. How do we go with having 300 people in this room and 3 of them have heard this story before? How come this has not become more widely discussed?
Well, it is being more widely discussed. I will tell you a story that kind of highlights that. I had a program I helped put together in 2011 it was a continuing legal education program. It was titled Judge Waties Waring and the Dissent That Changed America. And lawyers, not just in Charleston, but across South Carolina came, and we held it in the historic courtroom where Judge Waring had presided. And many people like you had never heard this story. They had this incredible American hero who had lived in that city and who was really, many people considered the father of Brown versus Board of Education, No one ever heard of him. Nobody knew about him. And at the end of the program, the lawyers, a group of lawyers came up to me and said, Judge, we're really embarrassed. And what we'd like to do is raise money for a statue to erect it on the federal courthouse grounds. Would you allow that? I said, absolutely. You guys go to it. And attending also was then retired United States Senator Ernest Hollins. Fritz came up to me, who I knew very well, and said, you know, I knew Judge Waring. I always admired Judge Waring. And I had intended to have the courthouse named for him. Well, the courthouse was the Ernest F. Hollins courthouse. And I said, well, Senator, the courthouse, of course, is named for you. He said, yes. One day I was trying to figure the right time to sort of spring this thing. And I came into my office one day, and I was advised by my staff that last night, Senator Thurman had put in an amendment that named an upstate lake for him and the courthouse for me. And it was just done. He says, but I want to change that. I want to take my name off the courthouse and name it for Judge Waring. I said, well, Fritz, you know, the judges don't name the courthouse. The Congress does. He said, of course I know that. And he said, but I want your help. And I said, Fritz, we like having your name on our courthouse. We'll find some other way to honor Judge Waring. But every time I saw Senator Hollins, I saw him about every 6 months, he would raise with me his idea to remove his name from the courthouse. And finally, he got sick of telling me and his former law partner, Mike Duffy, that he wanted to do this. And he called Senator Graham and Congressman Clyburn and told them. They both called me and said, you know, what's with Fritz? I said, well, guys, all I can tell you is for the last 5 years, every time I see him, he mentions it. And they said, very well. And they both sponsored in the House and the Senate the changing of the courthouse name. And in 2016, the courthouse was named the J. Waties Waring Judicial Center. How about that for a story, huh? So the story is getting out. Also, my book has sold 25,000 copies. I think somebody's reading it out there.
Matt, why don't you pick a question from the other side?
Yeah, if you have any question, please raise your hand.
This is very unlike this group. So the judge said you're going to have lots of questions here.
Yes, sir.
So how much of the dissent found its way into the Supreme Court?
The reasoning, the central difference between Plessy and Brown versus Board is that Plessy said that you had to try every case to determine whether the facilities were equal or not equal. And you would have been litigating until the cows came home. It would have just been impossible. There were, 100,000 school districts in America. I mean, it would have been crazy. It couldn't be done. Brown said all segregation mandated by the government is per se unconstitutional. That idea was Waties Waring's. And it is ironic, at the time of the Brown decision, many great thinkers in the great universities of America and within the national government were trying to figure out how do we undo the Gordian knot of Jim Crow? How do we get to this? How do we undo this? It was devastating us in international relations. It was terrible. The Russians were using every act of racial violence and racial segregation to show that Americans were a bunch of hypocrites. And who would figure it out but a patrician from Charleston, South Carolina? It's a remarkable story. Yes, ma'am.
What happened to, thank you for your presentation, it's amazing. What happened to Isaac Woodward?
Well, that's a common question I get. Isaac Woodard also moved to New York. His family had moved from Winnsboro to New York during World War II. So he was now blinded and disabled. He moved to moved to New York City, and initially he was something of a celebrity. He had a national speaking tour. they had this, event where 23,000 people came, and there was a very telling letter, memo, that an NAACP staffer wrote to Walter White, the executive director, and said, in 10 years, no one will remember his name. And they didn't. I didn't remember his name. And there was a particularly controversial decision made at the time that he did not qualify for disability benefits with the government, with the military, because he had been discharged about 3 hours earlier. But he was required to wear his uniform home. That was a requirement. And he's beaten. This is a guy with battlefield decorations on his chest. He's a sergeant. I mean, it's kind of an amazing story. And in 1961, Congress changed that law, pushed by many people who were sympathetic to Isaac Woodard. After that, he lived a kind of middle-class life. He had full benefits. He actually bought some real estate. He was a landlord. And that gentleman in that picture is his nephew, Robert Young. And I said, what was your job? He said, I had to collect the rent. He said, and my uncle could make a nickel scream. Yes, sir.
Judge, can you speak to the current issue? 20 years ago, when a federal judge issued a decision, no one looked to see who appointed them. Now, with all the current lawsuits pending all over the country, everyone looks to see, when the media talks about it, appointed by Obama, appointed by Trump. And my understanding of separation of church and state and separation of the three branches of government is no one's supposed to care, because once you become a federal judge, it doesn't matter who appointed you, it's you following the law.
Let me tell you something. The culture of, I've had many of my friends would say to me, oh my God, Trump's appointing these people, what will happen? No, our Trump appointees are very good in South Carolina, as were the Obama, as had been the Biden. And I credit a lot of this to Senator Graham, who is a big defender of the independence of the courts. And some people ask me sometimes about one of my colleagues, who appointed them, and I have to think a minute, because I don't see them that way, and they don't act that way. And the culture of the courts is so strong. During the 2020 election, they had 62 lawsuits. It didn't matter who appointed those judges. They were upholding the rule of law, rejecting those claims. And I was very proud of my colleagues all across the country. And it just doesn't matter. And right now, the judges in Washington, appointed by all the different presidents, are trying those January 6th cases, and it's all just playing it straight. They're not partisans. They're not politicians in robes, in black robes. And I'm very proud of my colleagues. Yes.
What happened with the relationship with Judge Waring and Thurgood Marshall as the years went along?
Well, Marshall really did revere Judge Waring. He was the first of sort of breakthrough judges that began ruling with plaintiffs in these cases. And Judge Waring retired in 1952. His papers, which are interestingly, he gave them to Howard University, because he said, I was worried if I gave them to a white university, no one would ever see them. And my wife and I spent a lot of time at Howard in the archives there. Judge Waring and his wife. I'm now forgotten my.
When your wife and you were in the archives.
Oh, right, we're in the archive. We're in the archives. Thank you. Somebody's listening. And I came across a draft copy of the brief in Brown versus Board of Education. Not the final one, a draft. And in the margins are comments by Judge Waring. And I went and found the final brief. He was helping Thurgood Marshall with the brief before the Supreme Court. He was retired. I mean, he was, but it was, I had to put it together. I had to think, what, this thing inside, what is this? And I realized it was a draft, working draft of the Brown brief. Yes.
Lady, young lady right here. Evan? Why don't you come on over here? We're getting feedback from that.
Yes.
There you go.
We have a question from the students. I love it.
That's great.
Great.
This is kind of like farther back, but whatever happened with the lynchings, like when did it become a federal law that they were like illegal, and who brought like attention to it?
I think lynching became a federal crime in 2020. Senator Scott proposed it. It had been, it was a kind of insanity that, if the federal government did anything on civil rights, it would be like the end of America, the end of the Southern way of life. So they fought everything. It was just total resistance. So lynching, and it's kind of amazing you'd have 4,000 murders and not one successful prosecution. It is just an alarming piece of American history. So that's what I said earlier. Some people will say to me, nothing's ever changed. I will say, guys, come on now. It may not be perfect now, and it's not. But the world in 1950 and today is just so different. And I mentioned about the Presidential Commission's report to secure these rights, which was this brilliant document. And this is what Harry Truman used to desegregate the military, which was just incredibly important moment in American history, his decision to create the first multiracial institution in America. And but much of that program that the Presidential Commission recommended was not adopted until the 1960s in the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. I mean, it just didn't happen. Truman did what, and let me just say, we are in the 75th anniversary of his executive order. And several weeks ago, I traveled to Washington, and I was participating in a program, on a 3-day program. Congressman Jim Clyburn and I were interviewed by the Librarian of Congress about this, and the next day President Biden spoke, and the chief of the Army, and the chief of the Chief of Staff of the Army, I've never seen 4 stars before, and many of them, including the President, credited Isaac Woodard. Yes, sir.
So, next year we'll be coming up on the 70th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Ed. And of course, the decision ended with all delivered speed, and yet we have, if anything else, widening gap in the academic achievement of minorities and whites, and you have now all these affirmative action decisions. I'm just curious whether, having done this work and done this book, whether you have any views about what can be done going forward to redress that and close that achievement.
Well, in my position, I'm the receiver of lawsuits, not the filer of one. So I'm going to decline that comment about any kind of strategy. But there's a lot of litigation going on out there. And, if you read American history, there are just cycles in which there is progress and there is retrenchment and then progress again. And beyond that, I don't think I should make any comment. These cases come in front of me all the time. Yes, sir. Next question. I got another student question. Great.
We'll make this the last question, folks. Judge Gergel has been very generous with his time. So, Vincent.
Did you face any backlash from writing this book or giving these presentations?
The short answer is no. And I wouldn't have been surprised if I had some, but I will tell you a story that many years ago, I had been told by some of what we would call sort of old Charleston, what a terrible person Judge Waring was. you know, I was, you know, kind of, at the time, didn't know a lot about him, but I was a little skeptical of what they were telling me. Well, in 2015, the lawyers in Charleston raised this money for a statue, I mentioned that, on the courthouse grounds. Attorney General Eric Holder spoke at the program, and I looked out, there were 900 people there, including many of those people who had told me what a terrible fellow he was. Some who were his family members. So I think the Waring family is fully claiming the judge now. And Mayor Riley made the statement about the statute. He says, the great judge has finally come home. Thank y'all very much.
Before you all leave, just remember that if you want to hear more about this story, some of the copies of the book will be back there with Judge Gergel signing copies for